On the night of the 26th of March, 1945, a column of American tanks and half-tracks pushed east into the dark interior of Germany, far past the point where any American unit had reason to be. There were roughly 300 men in that column, about 60 vehicles, 16 tanks, a string of half-tracks carrying infantry, a few jeeps running ahead as scouts. They moved with their headlights off down narrow roads that ran through sleeping Bavarian villages, and they were already, on that first night, nearly 60 miles behind the front line of the war. That distance is the whole story. American armored columns did not drive 60 miles past a collapsing enemy to reach a single objective. The front itself was moving east faster than almost anyone had predicted. Whatever lay 60 miles ahead would be overrun by the main advance within days. And yet these men had been pulled out of the line, handed fuel and ammunition, and sent alone into the dark toward a prisoner-of-war camp near the town of Hammelburg, a place most of them had never heard of until a few hours before they rolled. The man leading them was a captain named Abraham Baum, 24 years old. The order that put him on that road had not come from Baum, and it had not come from the division. It had come from the top, from the commander of the 3rd United States Army, from George S. Patton. And the question of why Patton sent 300 men 60 miles behind enemy lines that week, what he knew when he gave the order, and what it cost, would follow him for the rest of his life and shadow his reputation long after he was dead. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. To understand the order, you have to understand the moment. By late March of 1945, the war in Europe was in its final weeks, and everyone with a map could see it. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. The great river barrier that German commanders had hoped to hold through the spring was behind them now, and the armies that poured across it were moving into the German heartland at a speed that left the defenders reeling. Patton's Third Army was at the front of that race. His columns were covering ground so quickly that the problem was no longer the enemy. The problem was fuel and bridges and keeping the supply trucks anywhere close to the tanks. Patton lived for exactly this kind of war. He had spent his whole career convinced that speed and aggression won battles, that an army that kept moving could shatter an enemy who never got the chance to set his feet. For most of 1944 and into 1945, the war had finally let him prove it. But Patton was also a man who had nearly destroyed himself. In Sicily, 2 years earlier, he had struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in field hospitals, and the scandal had almost ended his career. He had been sidelined, publicly rebuked, made to apologize. He had watched the Normandy invasion happen without him while he sat in England as part of a deception scheme, a famous general used as bait. When he was finally given the Third Army, he commanded it like a man who believed every mile was a chance to answer the people who had written him off. That hunger, the need to keep pushing, was the engine of his greatness. It was also, in the last week of March 1945, about to lead him into one of the worst decisions of his command. The objective was a camp the Germans designated Auflage 13B on the high ground outside Hammelburg, in the hills of Lower Franconia. An Auflage was an officers' camp, and this one held a population that had grown through the long retreat of the German war. There were Serbian officers who had been prisoners since 1941, and there were Americans, hundreds of them, many of them officers who had been captured in the disaster at Kasserine in Tunisia back in 1943, and many more taken during the German counterattack in the Ardennes that winter, the battle Americans would come to call the Bulge. By the spring of 1945, those men were starving. As the Reich collapsed inward from east and west, the Germans had marched prisoners away from the advancing fronts, long columns of underfed men moving on foot through the cold, and the camps that received them were overcrowded and short of everything. The Americans inside Auflage 13B were living on thin soup and scraps of bread. Some had been behind the wire for 2 years. They had no idea how close the war was to ending. They only knew the hunger and the cold and the rumor, traded from bunk to bunk, that the Americans were coming. And here is the buried detail at the center of the whole affair, the fact that turns a military question into a human one. Among the American officers starving inside that camp was a lieutenant colonel named John Waters. Waters had been captured in Tunisia in 1943. He was a respected officer in his own right. He was also married to a woman named Beatrice, and Beatrice was George Patton's daughter. The man starving behind the wire at Hammelburg was Patton's son-in-law. Patton always insisted afterward that he had not known for certain that Waters was in that specific camp when he ordered the raid. He said he only suspected it. He said the mission was about freeing American prisoners, all of them, and that the presence of his son-in-law was something he learned of with confidence only later. A great many people in the United States Army did not believe him. They looked at the facts that a senior commander had sent 300 men 60 miles behind the lines to a camp the main advance would reach within a week, and they drew the conclusion that seemed obvious to them. They believed Patton had spent other men's lives trying to rescue his own family. Whether that is the full truth or a cruel simplification of a more tangled decision is something historians still argue about. What is not in dispute is that the suspicion attached itself to Patton immediately and never fully let go. The man chosen to lead the mission was Captain Abraham Baum, and there is a hard irony in the choice that the men who planned the raid could not have fully appreciated at the time. Baum was a young officer from the Bronx, by trade a pattern cutter in the garment district before the war, and he was Jewish. He was being sent to drive a small armored column deep into Nazi Germany, into the heart of a regime built on the extermination of his own people, on a mission whose odds even the men giving the orders privately understood to be poor. Baum had a reputation in the 4th Armored Division as exactly the kind of officer you want on a job like this. Aggressive, calm under pressure, able to think on the move. He would need all of it. The force assembled for him was drawn from the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead division of Patton's army. The outfit commanded in part by a tank officer named Creighton Abrams, who would one day become the Army's chief of staff and whose name a generation of American tanks would carry. And here the record points to a quieter argument inside the American command, the kind of disagreement that rarely makes it into the headline version of events. The officers closest to the mission understood that the job called for more than a few hundred men. A task this deep, this exposed, against an enemy who still had tanks and anti-tank guns and the will to use them, was work for a full combat command, a force several times larger. What Patton authorized was a task force of roughly company strength, beefed up with armor. 300 men where the situation called for thousands. Whether that decision was Patton's insistence on speed or a compromise forced by the limits of fuel and the chaos of fast-moving front, the result was the same. Baum went out under strength, and everyone who knew the ground knew it. There was one more thing that made the timing so difficult to justify, and it is the detail that gives the whole episode its weight. The main American advance was already rolling toward that part of Germany. Within a little over a week, the front would wash over Hammelburg on its own, and the camp would be liberated without a single special mission, without a single man sent 60 miles into the dark. The prisoners would have been freed either way. The only thing the raid could accomplish that the ordinary advance could not was speed. A few days, and for those few days, Patton was willing to gamble 300 men. They rolled on the night of the 26th of March. Task Force Baum, the column would be called, named for the captain leading it, and it slipped out through the lines and into German-held territory in darkness. The first hours went better than they had any right to. The German interior in those last weeks was a strange, broken landscape. Whole stretches of road were undefended. The local garrisons made up of old men and boys and the scattered remnants of units that had already been beaten somewhere else. The column shot through villages where startled defenders barely had time to react. They overran small roadblocks. They pushed through the night and into the morning, deeper and deeper into a country that was coming apart. But Germany was not empty, and it was not finished. As the task force drove on, word of the American column raced ahead of it through whatever telephone and radio links still functioned, and the Germans began to respond. There were still tanks in that part of the country, training units and stragglers, and the kind of improvised battle groups the Germans had become frighteningly good at throwing together. There were anti-tank guns. There were soldiers carrying the shoulder-fired Panzerfaust, the short-range weapon that could gut a Sherman tank at close quarters, and the towns the column had to pass through were exactly the kind of close terrain where that weapon was deadly. The column began to bleed. At the town of Gmunden, where the road crossed a river, the task force came up against real resistance, and the bridge they needed was blown in their faces, dropped into the water by German engineers before the Americans could seize it. That single act, an explosion on a bridge, forced Baum off his planned route and sent the column searching for another way across, north and around through country he had not intended to fight in. Every detour cost fuel. Every firefight cost men and vehicles. The task force that reached the hills near Hammelburg was smaller and more tired than the one that had set out, and it was now, by any measure, in serious trouble, surrounded by an enemy that was waking up to exactly what was happening and converging from every direction. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. It was the afternoon of the 27th of March when Task Force Baum fought its way up onto the high ground above the camp. The prisoners inside the wire heard it before they understood it. The sound of tank engines and gunfire, American gunfire, rolling toward them out of the west. After 2 years for some of them, after a winter of starvation for all of them, the sound that came up the hill was the sound they had stopped letting themselves believe in. Men climbed onto roofs and crowded against the wire to look. Some of them wept. The war had finally come for them. What followed at the camp was confusion layered on confusion. The German guards and the defending troops fought back. The task force put fire onto the camp's defenses. And somewhere in that chaos, with shells landing and the outcome of the fight still undecided, an attempt was made to arrange the surrender of the camp from the inside, to stop the shooting before the prisoners themselves were killed in the crossfire. A small party went out from the American prisoners toward the German lines under a white flag to try to bring the fighting to an end. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, Patton's son-in-law, was among them. He never reached safety. As the party moved out under the white flag, in the smoke and the noise where no one could be sure what anyone else intended, Waters was shot. The wound was severe, low in the body, the kind of wound that without proper surgery is a death sentence. He went down hard and was carried back inside, gravely hurt, his fate now hanging on whether anyone could get him real medical care in a country that no longer had any to spare. The man army would forever suspect this entire mission had been launched to save lay bleeding inside the very camp the task force had bled to reach. And then the second blow landed, the one that turned a hard day into a catastrophe. Baum got inside the wire. The prisoners were freed. Technically, the gates open, the guards overcome. But the scale of it was impossible. The captain had perhaps 300 men and a column of battered vehicles, and the camp did not hold a few dozen prisoners. It held well over 1,000, closer to 1,500. There was no possible way to carry 1,500 starving men out of Germany on a few half-tracks and the back decks of tanks. Some of the prisoners climbed aboard wherever they could find a handhold. Most would only stand and watch, or set out on foot, or simply sink back down, too weak to do anything at all. Night was coming again. The task force was nearly 60 miles behind the lines, low on fuel, down men and machines, burdened now with wounded and with as many freed prisoners as it could carry. Around it in the darkening hills, the Germans were no longer scattered and surprised. They were gathering. Tanks and anti-tank guns and infantry were closing the roads, one by one, behind and ahead of the small American column. The way in had been hard. The way back had not even begun. And every man on that hilltop, American soldier and freed prisoner alike, understood that the worst of it was still in front of them. The return march of Task Force Baum lasted only a few hours, and it ended in annihilation. Baum had 3 roads he might take west, and the Germans, who had the advantage of fighting on their own ground with intact communications, were closing all of them. Through the last of the daylight and into the night of the 27th of March, the column tried to break for home, and the country it had to cross was no longer the soft, surprised landscape of the night before. The enemy had set its feet. The German battle groups that converged on the hills around Hammelburg were a patchwork, the kind the Wehrmacht improvised brilliantly in its final months. Training unit tanks, anti-tank guns dug in along the roads. Infantry with the Panzerfaust waiting in the tree lines and the village streets where a tank's armor counted for least. They did not need to win a battle. They only needed to block the roads and wait for an exhausted, low-on-fuel American column to drive into them in the dark. And that is what happened. The task force was hit from the high ground, hit at the roadblocks, hit as it tried to push through the close country, and it came apart by pieces. Sherman tanks burned on the hillsides. The fuel that Baum had hoarded mile by mile ran out, and vehicles that could no longer move were abandoned and destroyed, so the enemy could not use them. The freed prisoners who had climbed aboard at the camp, men already starved to the edge of collapse, were caught in the firefights that erupted along the route, and some of them were killed in the very hours they had been freed, cut down on the roads of Germany that was days from surrender. The column that had set out 300 strong was being shredded, and there was no relief coming. No second force was driving to meet it. The main American front was still 60 miles to the west, advancing on its own schedule, and it had no idea Baum was in trouble because Baum, deep behind the lines, had largely lost the ability to call for help. By the morning of the 28th of March, it was over. The survivors of Task Force Baum, surrounded in the hills, out of fuel and nearly out of ammunition, were overrun. Captain Abraham Baum himself was wounded and taken prisoner. Of the roughly 300 men who had ridden east 2 nights before, only a handful, fewer than a dozen by most accounts, made it back to American lines under their own power. The rest were killed or captured. The vehicles were gone, every tank and half-track and jeep, lost in the country east of the Rhine. The task force had ceased to exist, and the men it had freed were freed no longer. The American prisoners from Offlog 13B who had climbed onto the tanks or set out on foot or been swept up in the breakout attempt were rounded up again by the Germans in the days that followed and marched back into captivity. After everything, after the burning tanks and the dead on the roads, the prisoners ended the week roughly where they had started it, behind the wire, still hungry, still waiting. The only thing that had changed was the number of dead and the wreck of an American column scattered across the Bavarian hills. There's a piece of this that has to be said plainly, because it is what gives the whole episode its terrible weight. 8 days later, in the first week of April, the ordinary advance of the United States Army reached Hammelburg. The front line, moving at its own pace, washed over the camp without a special mission, without a deep raid, without a single tank sent 60 miles into the dark. Offlog 13B was liberated on the schedule of the war itself. The prisoners walked free. Had no order ever been given, had Task Force Baum never rolled, those same men would have been liberated within days at no cost at all. Everything the raid spent, the 300 men, the tanks, the dead prisoners, the wreck of a fine young captain's column, bought nothing the calendar would not have delivered for free a week later. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, Patton's son-in-law, the man whose presence in the camp would forever shadow the mission, survived. He had been shot during the attempt to arrange the camp's surrender, and his wound was grave, but he lived. When the main advance reached Hammelburg in April, he was still there, still alive, treated as best the camp's circumstances allowed, and he was evacuated to proper care. He recovered. He went on to a long army career and rose to high rank in the years after the war. The cruelty of the arithmetic is hard to look at directly. The one man the army suspected the raid had been launched to save was freed, not by the raid, which failed, but by the same ordinary advance that would have freed him anyway. The mission added nothing to his rescue except the wound he took while it was happening. Now we come to the reckoning, and to the question the whole story turns on. What did Patton do, and what did the army do when the scale of the disaster became clear? The first thing Patton did was contain it. A general who had nearly been destroyed, once already by scandal understood exactly how this would look. He moved to keep the affair quiet, to treat it as a minor raid that had run into bad luck rather than a costly mission sent on a personal errand. In his public posture and in the way the episode was handled inside his command, the loss of Task Force Baum was minimized, folded into the noise of a fast-moving front where small actions were lost every day. For a time it worked. The war was racing toward its end. The headlines were full of advances and crossings and the collapse of the Reich, and the destruction of a single small column 60 miles behind the lines did not, at first, draw the scrutiny it deserved. But Patton was a diarist, and he was not, in private, a man who lied to himself easily. In his own writing, he wrestled with the thing directly. He acknowledged that he had known, or strongly believed, that his son-in-law was among the prisoners. He admitted that the knowledge had been a factor. And then he reached for the defense that men in his position have always reached for. He wrote that his error had been not sending too small a force, but too small a one, that had he sent a full combat command instead of a few hundred men, the mission might have succeeded. It is a revealing thing to have written. It concedes the personal motive while recasting the failure as a matter of insufficient force rather than a mission that should never have been ordered at all. The historians who have studied his diaries have read those passages as something close to a confession wrapped in a justification, the words of a man who knew what he had done and could not quite bring himself to call it by its name. The army's reaction, as the facts spread, was colder than the public record suggested. Inside the officer corps, among the men who understood what had been spent and why, the Hammelburg raid became one of the marks against Patton, set down quietly alongside the slapping incidents in Sicily, evidence in the long internal argument about whether his brilliance was worth the recklessness that came with it. Captain Baum, when he was eventually liberated from German captivity at the end of the war, learned only afterward the thing that had been kept from him when he was given the order. He had not been told, when he was sent east, that the camp held the commanding general's son-in-law. He had been sent into a fight at company strength against odds that called for a division, on a mission whose real shape had not been fully explained to the man asked to die for it. Baum survived and went home and lived a long life and spoke about the raid in later years with a soldier's hard clarity. He had done his duty. He had been given an impossible job with too few men. He did not pretend it had been anything other than what it was. So we return to the road on which we began, the column slipping east in the dark with its headlights off, 60 miles behind the lines, 300 men riding toward a camp most of them had never heard of. The title of this story asks what Patton's response was, and promises that it shook the army. The honest answer is more uncomfortable than any tidy version of battlefield justice. Patton's response to learning that American officers, perhaps including his own family, were starving behind the wire was to reach past every sound military judgment and send a force too small on a mission the war itself would have made unnecessary within the week. And the thing that shook the army was not a triumph. It was the recognition, settling in quietly among the men who knew, that one of its greatest commanders had spent the lives of 300 men on something that looked, from every angle, like a personal errand, and had then tried to make the cost disappear. That is the hard center of the man, and it is why his story still matters. Patton's aggression, his refusal to wait, his conviction that speed and will could overcome anything, was the same quality that made him one of the most effective battlefield commanders the United States ever produced. It drove the Third Army across France and through the German heartland at a pace his enemies could not match. And it was the same quality, untethered from judgment by the pull of family and the hunger to act, that sent Task Force Baum to its destruction in the hills above Hammelburg. The strength and the flaw were not two different things. They were one thing, and in the last week of March 1945, the flaw was in command. There is no clean verdict to hand down here, and the channel has never pretended otherwise. The men of Task Force Baum were not fools or cowards. They were good soldiers, well led by a brave young captain, sent on a job that the most senior commander in their army should never have given them. The prisoners they tried to free were freed anyway by the ordinary, grinding advance of the war, a week later and at no cost. The general who ordered them out lived another 9 months and died, not in battle, but in a car accident in occupied Germany in December of that same year, his contradictions unresolved, his greatness and his recklessness buried in the same grave. What he had done at Hammelburg he carried with him to the end, in the pages of a diary where he had already half admitted the truth. The question the story leaves open is the one worth sitting with. When the man giving the order is also the man with the most to gain, who is left to tell him no? Patton had spent his career being the one who refused to wait, who pushed when others hesitated, who was proven right often enough that the people around him learned to trust the instinct even when it frightened them. At Hammelburg, that instinct ran past the edge of judgment, and the men who might have stopped him did not, because stopping George Patton was not a thing the Third Army had ever been built to do. 300 men paid for that. Whether you call it devotion, or arrogance, or simple human weakness in a man too powerful to be checked, is the verdict this story leaves to you. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.